But first, we want to update you as best we can with what's happening in the Sudan, while uprisings continue in citizen-led labor union and youth-oriented movements to complete a revolutionary change. This process began in 2018 with civilian protests across the country protesting against Omar al-Bashir, a military strongman who had led Sudan for 30 years. There were many objections that students, activists across ethnic and religious divides and labor unions had against Omar al-Bashir. These protests, though, were spurred in the main because of austerity and cuts and price increases on essential goods. Those protests were successful. That led to a military-led coup that ousted Bashir a couple of months ago, but not the civilian transfer. This was the lesson of so many of the uprisings that emanated from 2011 in the Middle East. Not an exact parallel, but of course the tragic lessons of Egypt, where a revolutionary action that was completed by the military when they basically removed Mubarak from power, they allowed an election to take place eventually, putting the Muslim Brotherhood in power. Morsi, of course, was now dead after a ruthless coup backed in part by Israel and others. And of course, while we're no fans of the Muslim Brotherhood, we do recognize that the fact that just within years of a revolutionary movement against sort of neoliberal autocracy, the fact that Egypt is even more authoritarian and brutal under the leadership of al-Sisi is an incredible catastrophe. The Sudanese people, of course, knew this, so they stayed on the streets. The military eventually reacted. On June 3rd, the Khartoum massacre group, the RSF, which stands for Rapid Support Forces, a group killed at least an estimated 128 protesters. They raped women. They dumped bodies in the Nile to hide that total number. The Rapid Defense Forces were developed out of the Janjaweed, the group responsible for war crimes and genocide in Darfur. In response, the Sudanese Professional Association called for civil disobedience and a general strike that was widely successful. Protests continue against military and paramilitary forces and barricading of roads. On the June 12th, the SPA and the Freedom and Change Alliance, which represents the pro-democracy movement, suspended the general strike in order to resume negotiations in response to a military council release of political prisoners. The African Union and Ethiopia have been pushing for negotiations over the weekend, and a roadmap that would include 15-member council, 8 civilian and 7 military, would lead the transition, according to the latest reporting from the Associated Press. The key question, of course, is what is, in fact, the military in this conflict? We know that the military should not be ruling Sudan, but in fact, between the paramilitary and the military itself, there's different factions. The military is not one cohesive force. There's a struggle between the Sudanese military and paramilitary forces. The leader of the RSF, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, also known as Hamedi, has solidified a lot of power over the past couple of months. He's culpable not only for war crimes in Darfur, but in the last couple of years, after drawing huge condemnation from European powers and the United States, including an international indictment of Omar al-Bashir for war crimes, the EU has made deals with the RSF and helped with in terms of blocking migrants from entering the Mediterranean. So this same genocidal paramilitary has worked with European Union powers to block migrants from getting to EU territory. The RSF is also fighting under the Saudi campaign of genocide in Yemen. The international situation is such that RSF, as I mentioned, is backed by the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Egypt is supporting the military council as well. And the RSF has profited immensely from war in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pledged $3 billion to stabilize Sudan's economy. However, the people have power. The Sudanese people have been resolved and fearless and continue to do so, regardless of the brutality of the regime and the paramilitary forces. To show solidarity with Sudan, we must highlight Sudanese voices and struggle while highlighting the financial and political international apparatus that wants to keep people under military dictatorship. It was very trendy several years ago to talk about the crimes committed by Omar al-Bashir and the Janjaweed, and rightfully so, even though some of that discourse obscured the complicated political and regional dynamics of Sudanese politics. But in the last couple of years, Bashir has worked his way back into something approaching some type of rapprochement, at least with the Europeans, and obviously the Trump administration has no regard for human life in general, even above and beyond the usual relentless disregard for human life by U.S. foreign policy. This is a bottom-up action generated by a democracy movement, by students, by labor unions. This is fundamentally bottom-up African politics. It's time that we account for and follow it in the same way when it could be a projection of so-called humanitarian impulses from the West. All right. Do you guys have anything you want to jump in on that?
I mean, it's been very exciting. The success of the general strike, of just the coordination that we've seen in Sudan has been really important. Definitely. And another thing too, to just warn against, it's very popular in the West. Don't fetishize technology over people's movements, right? So even though people are using social media to highlight their voices, they're doing it because of the social forces and incredible organizing on the ground, not because, oh, how lucky are these people because they now have Facebook because the United States gave it to them.
In fact, not only that, I mean, look at it in a smart way. I mean, Sudan under Omar al-Bashir in 2011, I remember the reports were that the Sudan were, because of course, I mean, the uprisings that moved through the Middle East and North Africa in that time period in places like Tunisia and Egypt and so on, it affected Sudan, and there were uprisings in Sudan. The Sudanese were pioneers in using social media events to generate fake protests as a means to disrupt movements and hand over protesters to the intelligence services. So absolutely, this is about people power, and the technology is always secondary to that, without a doubt. That's a very good point. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.